A woman in 19th century America watched the scientific revolution systematically dismantle everything her faith stood on, and instead of retreating to the pews, she picked up the language of science and turned it back on the scientists. Today, we're diving into Mary Baker Eddy, her audacious attempt to reframe prayer as a scientific process, what the research calls the long arc of epiphanic thresholds that made her story both inevitable and tragic, and what her rise and fall reveals about the collision between religion and science that still echoes today. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why Eddy's gamble was actually more sophisticated than her critics admit, and why the institution she built became the very thing she was fighting against. Joining me to unpack all of this is someone who's gone deep into this research, so let's get into it. The research describes Eddy as swimming against all currents. What does that actually mean in the context of the world she was living in?
So to understand Eddy, you really have to understand the moment she was born into. The research frames the entire 19th century as a series of what it calls epiphanic thresholds, moments where a single scientific discovery shifts the entire paradigm of human understanding. And the research traces all of this back to one invention, Ibn Sal's optical lens.
Ibn Sal's lens, as in one lens starts this whole chain reaction?
That's exactly the argument. From that single invention, you get Galileo's telescope, then Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, then Malthus, Darwin, Pasteur, each discovery building on the last, each one widening the schism between religion and science. And the research is very specific. Every time humanity crosses one of these epiphanic thresholds, the cognitive dissonance that follows produces social upheaval. And with each new epiphany, the severity of that upheaval gets worse.
So by the time Eddy arrives on the scene, this schism is already pretty wide.
Enormous. By the late 19th century, the research describes accredited academia as having extended the laboratory prohibition against bias, even divine bias, into a full prohibition against the divine anywhere and everywhere. Marx had elevated that prejudice into what was being presented as a scientific maxim. And the ecclesiastical school, the church scholars, were on the back foot. They felt compelled to defend, on terms dictated by science, not just their personal convictions, but the very existence of God.
And that's a losing position, right? Because you're playing on the other side's court.
Exactly. And the research is quite pointed about this. Most church fathers of that era believed science was a passing fad. They thought, would not the church look foolish in new clothes the moment intellectual fashion changed? So they retreated to their offices and offered prayer for the salvation of society's soul. Mary Baker Eddy looked at that strategy and fundamentally disagreed.
So what was her alternative?
She recognized that the scientific revolution was not merely rhetorical, it was, as the research puts it, minting an entirely new coin of the realm, one which valued proof over faith. And she realized that if the word science was ceded entirely to the agnostics and atheists, it would be religion's undoing. Her argument was, if God is truth, if creation is founded on divine laws, then empirical method cannot fail to prove this as fact.
That's actually a pretty bold logical move.
It is, and the research gives her real credit for it. Eddy decided the way to cope with an aspirant, atheist insurgency in accredited academia was to claim the scientific ground in the name of the Creator. If God's miracles all had a scientific explanation, then prayer too was scientific. The research says the amount of ground she reclaimed was astounding, not just for a woman, but for anyone.
Right, and we should probably talk about who she actually was as a person, because her background is complicated.
Very. The research describes her father, Mark Baker, as, quote, a tiger of a man who bullied and berated everyone from his daughter to his neighbors. He was an open supporter of slavery, despite being quite removed from the practice in New Hampshire. And the research situates him squarely within the pseudo-scientific current of his time, a man who had absorbed the Darwinian and Marxist arguments that Africans were a distinct species before either hypothesis had even run the gauntlet of peer review.
So she grew up in that environment. And then there's the question of her health, which the research handles very differently from how most historians do.
This is one of the most interesting parts of the research. The standard academic line on Eddy's chronic health problems, the sudden fits, the writhing, the periods of apparent unconsciousness, is that she was suffering from psychosomatic illness, hypochondria, or what critics called histrionics. The research is quite blunt. Scholars today feel obligated to kick Mary Baker Eddy when she is down because she dared to codify in church doctrine a heresy against science.
So the research pushes back on that diagnosis entirely?
It does, and it offers a specific alternative. The research argues, with some confidence, that Eddy had contracted a tropical parasite called strongyloides, likely from pork products imported from the Caribbean. And strongyloidiasis is particularly insidious because of what the research calls autoinfection. When the parasite reaches the end of its life cycle, it reinfects the victim. So one becomes a hundred compounds into thousands, thousands into millions.
And the symptoms would have looked like what exactly?
The research describes what are called drop attacks, a sudden loss of vestibular control, vertigo so intense and painful as to induce screaming, where the body literally throws the victim to the floor. The research is very specific. The physical response is not dissimilar to a seizure. And in the advanced stages, neurological damage becomes inevitable. Chronic digestive illness, ulcerations, infection, sepsis. The research notes that no one could plausibly have known about this parasite until the mid-20th century.
So every physician who failed to diagnose her gets a pass, but every scholar who diagnoses her from afar or from beyond the grave, the research calls absurdities who should be ignored.
Exactly that. And here's where it gets really interesting for understanding her intellectual project. The research argues that if Eddy did have strongyloidiasis, the sudden onset, progressive intensity, and equally sudden resolution of symptoms would incline the patient to perceive miraculous cures. In an age when the only viable medical treatment for most diseases was prayer, that experience would naturally lead someone to investigate the power of prayer very seriously.
So her theology wasn't just inherited doctrine, it was, in a sense, empirically motivated by her own lived experience of illness and apparent recovery. That's the research's argument, yes. And it's a generous reading, but not an uncritical one. Eddy's core conviction was that diseases were the product of moral failings, the direct consequences of personal sin, and, in the final analysis, weak faith in God. The research notes this was the dominant belief system among believers of the world's major religions at the time. What Eddy attempted was to reiterate those traditional Christian beliefs about disease and morality in scientific terms, to baptize the Christian faith in scientific light. And the research points out she was not alone in that belief. This wasn't a fringe position.
Not at all.
But she was among the last to attempt it systematically.
And the research frames her as the first witness it would call to the stand in what it describes as the case of pseudoscience versus the people, which is a striking framing.
It is. So let's talk about how she actually built this framework. Because she didn't just pray and call it science, she engaged with the intellectual currents of her time, including some pretty unconventional ones.
Right. And this is where the mesmerist Quimby enters the picture. Quimby practiced in New England just before the Civil War, and mesmerists of his school were convinced that the resolution, if not the cause, of disease processes were largely determined in the mind. Eddy visited Quimby and, by her own account, experienced what she perceived as a cure.
And critics use that to paint her as a mystic or a spiritualist.
They do, but the research rests its defense of Eddy on her own words about Quimby. She wrote, "P. Quimby of Portland has the spiritual truth of diseases. You must imbibe it to be healed. Go to him again and lean on no material or spiritual medium." And the research says her acquittal is found in those words, lean on no material or spiritual medium. She was not endorsing Quimby as a medium. She was endorsing the principle and then moving beyond it.
That's a really fine distinction. She's extracting the mechanism from the mysticism.
Precisely. And the research notes she rejected mentalists and hypnotists again and again, always for cause, always for lack of efficacy. She kept returning to her original investigation of the efficacy of prayer, and what she arrived at was a concept she called animal magnetism, which the research describes as replacing the religious superstition of demon possession with a flaw in the organic mind of every individual.
Wait, so she's essentially proposing something like an unconscious mind before Freud?
That's the research's argument. It says that great minds like Freud, Jung, and Adler later co-opted constructs in their own theses in 1910 that Eddy had already been working with. And the research is quite pointed. Atheists in accredited academia like to kick Mary Baker Eddy when she is down because she came closer to an effective model of psychology than many psychoanalysts of her day.
That's a striking claim. And it connects to something the research says about modern psychology and prayer. There's actually a data point here that I find really compelling.
Yes. The research cites the most recent work by psychologists confirming that patients with similar diagnoses and similar prognoses exhibit more than just a placebo-like outcome in the healing process as a direct, predictable benefit of their attitude. Convince a patient they will be healed, and in cases where they are healed, it is more likely they will heal quicker. And the researcher's observation is, modern psychology will readily accept the Nobel Prize for this astounding research. Just be aware Mary Baker Eddy proposed the efficacy of the phenomenon first.
That's a bit of a burn, honestly.
A very dry one. And it's fair. Agnostic scholars today attribute the power of prayer to a placebo effect. Classical scholars are receptive to more than just a placebo effect. But the researcher's point is that Eddy was doing serious, if imperfect, investigation of this linkage between mind and wellness at a time when the only viable medical treatment for most diseases was prayer anyway.
So in that context, what harm could a little prayer healing do? That's actually a line from the research.
It is, and the research is careful to say it would not turn to the Church of Christ scientists for medical advice today, especially if critically ill. But in the late 19th century, in that ambiguous interval between the Civil War and 1905, traditional medicine and emerging medicine were both, as the research puts it, a game of roulette in their own right.
So she's not operating in a vacuum where there's a clearly superior alternative she's ignoring. The alternatives were genuinely terrible.
Exactly. And that context matters enormously for evaluating her fairly. Now, where Eddy's framework runs into serious trouble is in the concept of malicious animal magnetism, the idea that diseases were a spiritual imbalance, a product of sin. The research acknowledges this directly. On that matter, Mary Baker Eddy was categorically proven incorrect.
And the proof came in 1905.
1905. That's the year it was proven that bacteria, not malicious animal magnetism, were responsible for most diseases in humans. And the research traces this back to Robert Koch, a German biologist, who had actually made the true discovery in 1883 through his research on anthrax and tuberculosis. But here's the extraordinary part. Koch's research was rejected by colleagues despite producing replicable results.
Wait, replicable results and peers still rejected it?
The research puts it starkly, peers can advance a hypothesis like Darwin's and Marx's without fulfilling any objective investigative criteria. In contrast, documentable results like Koch's are suppressed due to professional jealousies. The research calls this a catastrophic flaw in peer review, and it's the same flaw that allowed pseudoscience to flourish throughout this entire arc.
So the very mechanism that's supposed to protect science from bad ideas is also capable of suppressing good ones.
That's the researcher's diagnosis, and it names the first scientist to actually prove that Van Leeuwenhoek's animalcules, what we now call microorganisms, were causing diseases. Not Koch, not Pasteur, a farm boy from Michigan named Erwin Frink Smith.
Erwin Frink Smith, a farm boy from Michigan. That's not a name that shows up in most history books.
And that's part of the researcher's broader point about how history gets written and who gets credit. But back to Eddy. She died of what the records call pneumonia, just 5 years after the 1905 confirmation. But the research raises a pointed observation. At that point in scientific history, pneumonia was a category of symptoms into which strongyloidiasis fell unambiguously.
Because the parasite in its larval form lives in the lungs.
Exactly. The research argues that in advanced strongyloidiasis, the immune system can no longer keep up with the cycle of infection and fills the lungs with eosinophils. And, as the research puts it, just like COVID does to its victims, the patient literally drowns in their own immune response. The research acknowledges this reads as armchair medicine, but notes that in the year of Eddy's death, the pathogens which caused true pneumonia had not yet been identified. So all diagnoses of Mary Baker Eddy are, in the researcher's words, armchair diagnoses.
That's a fair point. And there's something almost unbearably poignant about the timing. She lived long enough to see her lifelong convictions undone.
The research leaves that hanging as an open question. Did she live long enough to register the significance of the 1905 confirmation? And one is left wondering. The research notes she never turned her back on the Creator, on the truth of Christ, on the validity of religion, or the efficacy of prayer. But the scientific ground she had claimed in God's name had been taken back.
And then there's the question of what happened to the institution she built. Because the Church of Christ scientists didn't disappear in 1905.
No. And this is where the research identifies what it calls the tragic irony. The church became an anachronism in 1905, but it persists because its adherents idolize Mary Baker Eddy above the truth. And the research's conclusion is devastating. The Church of Christ scientists today practices that which Mary Baker Eddy was trying to defeat.
Mhm.
Pseudoscience.
She was fighting pseudoscience with what turned out to be pseudoscience, and the institution she left behind doubled down on it.
The research puts it directly, you cannot cast out pseudoscience with pseudoscience, and it diagnoses the underlying failure, not just in Eddy's case, but across this entire arc of history, as idolatry. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of scripture than to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry.
And the research says we are all susceptible to it because we define ourselves too much by what we believe.
That's the research's central argument. When those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs. And what every major religion instructs, and what peer review of science enforces, is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is, the research says, the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the animal magnetism concept, because I think it deserves a bit more unpacking, because Eddy's rejection of an unembodied evil in the universe was actually a pretty radical theological move.
It was. The research describes it as Eddy daring to propose a heaven without a hell, a creator without a devil. And in rejecting her concept of animal magnetism and malicious animal magnetism, the established church effectively declared there could be no good without evil. The research calls that an extraordinary contrast and finds the implications resolve in Eddy's favor.
So she's simultaneously too scientific for the church and too religious for the scientists.
Caught in the crossfire from both flanks. And the research makes a pointed observation about that. It recalls Galileo every time zealots on both flanks attack anyone taking a stand toward the center. Fringe though the denomination she started now is, the research insists Mary Baker Eddy's life story is more than worth telling.
And she also drove the final nail in her own ecclesiastical coffin, the research mentions this, by insisting that men and women preachers equally lead congregations in her church.
Yes, which, in the late 19th century, was another front she was fighting on simultaneously. The research doesn't dwell on it, but it's worth noting she was challenging the gender hierarchies of the church at the same time she was challenging the epistemological hierarchies of science. That's an enormous amount of ground to be contesting at once.
And the research's overall verdict on her is what? Flawed but significant?
The research is careful and fair. It says any unbiased evaluation of the two positions, Eddy's claim that God is the eternal truth underlying all phenomena, and therefore is as scientific as anything could be, will have to rule in favor of Eddy on that specific logical point. And then it adds, with what I can only describe as dry affection, you have to admit it. The woman had a point.
She had a point, and she also had parasites, apparently.
The research does not let that go, but the larger point is this. Eddy stands out among all the historical figures discussed in the research because she lived to witness her lifelong hypotheses undone with a single discovery. The research notes, with some bite, that we are all still waiting for Darwin and Marx to come to their senses.
That is a line. Okay, so when you step back from everything we've covered, the arc from Ibn Sahl's lens through Galileo, Van Leeuwenhoek, Darwin, Pasteur, Koch, Erwin Frick Smith, and finally to Eddy, what does the research want us to take away from all of this?
The research's central thesis is that every time humanity crosses an epiphanic threshold, every time a paradigm-shifting discovery is made, the cognitive dissonance that follows produces social upheaval. And with each new epiphany, the severity of that upheaval is amplified. Eddy's story is one node in that arc. She was not going gently into the pseudoscientific night. She was fighting back, but the tools she used were ultimately insufficient.
And the research's diagnosis of why? Idolatry. Not in the religious sense alone, but in the sense that we all, scientists and theologians alike, risk becoming more devoted to our frameworks than to the truth those frameworks are supposed to serve.
Exactly. And the research is honest that this is not a solved problem. The failure of peer review to maintain its integrity, allowing hypothesis to be presented to the public as settled science before peers have even confirmed it, is described as an ongoing catastrophic flaw. Koch's replicable results were suppressed by professional jealousy. Darwin and Marx gained patronage before either hypothesis had run the gauntlet of peer review. The pattern repeats.
And the research connects this directly to consequences that go far beyond academic debate. The march it describes ends somewhere very dark.
The research is explicit that this arc, from Ibn Sal's lens through every epiphanic threshold, leads toward the socialist holocaust of the 20th century. Eddy's story sits at a crucial juncture, the end of the 19th century. Sensing academia's encroachment on religious paradigms of investigation, she attempted to reframe religion and specifically prayer as a scientific process. But in 1905, with the proof that diseases were not punishments from God, but the biological consequences of pathogens, the divorce between religion and science became, in the researcher's words, final.
And from that point forward, the research argues, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia, but the few following empirical method were outpaced by those publishing pseudoscience in what the research calls an orgy of intellectual ambition.
Which brings us to 1910, Café Central in Vienna, and a cast of characters the research describes with remarkable specificity. Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, Dmitry Mitrinovich, and Vladimir Lenin in absentia. And on the periphery, a loner named Adolf, soaking it all in from a table across the room. All of this, the research insists, from the consequences of Ibn Sal's lens.
That is a staggering chain of causation to lay out, and it makes Eddy's story feel less like a footnote and more like a hinge point.
That's precisely how the research positions her. She was the last serious attempt by the ecclesiastical school to claim the scientific ground before the divorce became final. And the research mourns, in a quiet way, for believers like Eddy who lived daily in the conviction that their faith or their behavior was inadequate in God's eyes, because that conviction was itself a product of the doctrine that disease was a consequence of sin.
There's something genuinely tragic about that. A woman who spent her entire life investigating the connection between mind and healing, who was chronically ill, who believed her illness was a reflection of her own moral inadequacy, and who was almost certainly suffering from a parasite nobody could have identified.
And who, despite all of that, never turned her back on the Creator, on the truth of Christ, on the validity of religion, or the efficacy of prayer. The research is insistent on that point. Whatever her errors, whatever the limitations of her framework, Eddy's commitment to investigation, to returning again and again to the question of what actually works, was genuine.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. The research isn't asking us to become Christian scientists. It's asking us to recognize that the pattern of epiphany, followed by dissonance, followed by upheaval, is not a historical curiosity. It's a recurring feature of how human beings respond to paradigm-shifting knowledge. And Eddy's story is one of the clearest illustrations of what happens when someone tries to bridge that gap and gets caught in the crossfire.
And the researcher's actionable insight, if we can call it that, is that the antidote to idolatry, whether theological or scientific, is the same thing, a genuine commitment to manifest truth over the frameworks we use to approach it. Peer review exists for exactly that reason. When it fails, the consequences compound. When it works, it's the closest thing we have to a collective immune system against our own worst intellectual instincts.
And the research is clear that it has failed, repeatedly, in ways that had catastrophic consequences. Koch's replicable results suppressed. Darwin and Marx elevated before verification. Hypothesis presented as science to a public hungry for answers.
The research puts it plainly. News of a hypothesis leaks from the lab, makes it to print, and gains traction in the imaginations of the public long before academic peers are even required to confirm it. The headlines are always the same. Everything from nuclear fusion to a cure for cancer is just around the corner. Headlines breed optimism, optimism breeds patronage, and no patrons means no grants. Thus has it ever been with science since the Renaissance.
So the incentive structure of science itself creates pressure toward premature certainty, which is exactly the thing Eddy was fighting against, and exactly the thing her own church eventually succumbed to.
Full circle. The researcher's final word on Eddy is generous but clear-eyed. She had extraordinary courage to try.
The mumbo-jumbo she adopted in trying to express religious rights in scientific terms offends both religious and scientific sensibilities. But the attempt itself, the refusal to cede the word science to those who would use it to dismantle the divine, was not foolish. It was, in its way, heroic. She didn't go gently. And that matters, even when the conclusion is that she lost.
The research would agree. And it would add, the fact that historians and psychologists alike love to take Mary Baker Eddy apart is itself a signal that she deserves to be considered. The research recalls Galileo every time zealots on both flanks attack anyone taking a stand toward the center.
That's a line worth sitting with. We started this episode with a woman who looked at the scientific revolution and decided to fight it on its own terms. She built a church, proposed a psychology before psychology had a name, and lived to see the ground shift beneath her feet. The research asks us to regard her in a more forgiving light, not because she was right about everything, but because the courage to investigate, to refuse easy answers, to keep returning to the question of what actually works. That is, in the end, what both good science and good faith have always required. And if the arc from Ibn Sahl's lens to Café Vienna teaches us anything, it's that the cost of getting that wrong is not abstract. It is very, very real.